Hi, my name is Emily Kane. I'm in the Department of Sociology at Bates College, and I'm recording this screencast of the webinar that I was planning to present today for the LA Chamber of Commerce. And for any of you who were at that webinar when it was happening in person, we ended up with some technical difficulties on my end and decided it was better to end the webinar where we were and for me to record it and send it along. So this is that recording. For anyone who's joining fresh and wasn't with us at that point, I am going to start from the beginning again so that we have a complete recording for anyone who wants to take a look. So I'm going to share my screen now and use that as an opportunity to get slides up on the screen for you and work our way through some material. So first of all, I want to say thank you for watching or for attending if you were here this morning. And again, for those who were, so sorry for the glitches on my end. I guess this is the remote work world that we're all trying to find ways to adjust to. You can see here on the first slide that I've included my email address, ekane@bates.edu. And I'll mention this again along the way, but I would be happy to be in touch with anybody who's got questions or suggestions or wants to see if we could partner on something at any point. So I'm going to be talking, as you know, about challenges facing families and employees engaged in remote work during the COVID-19 crisis. And I wanted to start by giving you just a very brief bit of background about myself so that you have some context for thinking about what I work on, what kind of things I've done locally in Lewiston, Auburn, and that may give you ideas for things you'd like to ask me questions about later, or also about opportunities to partner on projects if you think anything about my background connects to the work that you're doing in the area as well. So I teach courses on family, on childhood and youth, on communities, and on how social inequalities shape people's lives. So my attention to family, children, youth, community is all in the context of thinking about inequalities and the way they affect people's lives. And I've been at Bates for almost 25 years now. And over those years, I've done a lot of community-based research and action projects in Lewiston, Auburn with a lot of different local partners. And I wanted to tell you about just some of the topics that I've covered in those projects so that you have a sense of the kind of things I've worked with and the kind of folks I've worked with around the community. I've done work on adverse childhood experiences and ACEs, or also called ACEs, and I'll say more about that in a little while in terms of how trauma might shape people's responses to remote work during the crisis. I've worked with partners who are interested in child abuse prevention, parenting challenges, housing insecurity, and food insecurity. I've worked with partners interested in expanding banking access, and also partners working on different approaches to poverty reduction in our local communities. Plus, my students often work with schools, after-school programs, and other youth-serving organizations in the area. So I've got experience with a wide range of local partners and local issues over the years, and I'm always interested in new partnerships, as is the Harvard Center for Community Partnerships at Bates. So I'd be happy to hear from anyone who had ideas after listening to all of this. I also just want to say, before I begin to get into the substance of what I'll talk about, that I really appreciate the opportunity to be in conversation, I guess we could call it, even though this is the recorded version. We weren't able to make the live webinar work because of these technical glitches, but still, it's a conversation in the sense that I'll be talking about some issues and would very much welcome hearing from any of you. And so I just know that we're all struggling right now in a really difficult moment, internationally, nationally, locally, and I'm glad to be in conversation with you all about how we can work together, support each other in addressing these many challenges. So the topics for today: common challenges for families and employees during the COVID-19 crisis. That's the topic you saw for the webinar when you registered for it. And that's going to be me offering an overview of some key patterns, common issues that are being identified by family sociologists and others in related fields as they look at what's happening for folks during the crisis who are working at home. And then the second part I had, when we were going to be a live webinar, discussion of how we can all support each other in relation to those challenges. So I was looking for participant comments on challenges you're seeing and resource sharing that we might be able to do among us all. That part is not going to work out in the recorded version, but that's what I'd welcome hearing from you by email anytime. So with that said, let me start with the first challenge. And for anyone who attended the live webinar as long as it lasted, these first few slides are things that you had begun to see. So maybe you'll be able to just fast forward through if you'd like. But the first common challenge I want to talk about for families and employees working remotely during the COVID-19 crisis is that most basic and fundamental one: space and equipment for safe and productive remote work. Access to quiet space, access to proper ergonomic equipment, things like chair, desk, keyboard, mouse, monitor, etc., access to technology, and also competition for it within households. So if there are many people at home having to do work or school, and I'll talk more about that as I go along, then they may all be competing for turns using the technology or accessing the one computer that has internet access, whatever it might be. Very important to keep in mind that all of these vary a great deal by income, by household resources, and by health status, right? So who's going to have access to quiet space? Someone with enough resources to have a larger apartment or home with more space for them. Who's going to have access to proper ergonomic equipment, to a nice setup that's comfortable? Who could afford to buy another high quality mouse if they needed a special mouse because of carpal tunnel, or the right kind of chair for proper support, et cetera? That's going to be somebody with more resources, but also that's going to intersect in important ways with health status, of course, because for folks who have more underlying health conditions, that may make it even more critical that they have that proper setup in their chair, desk, keyboard, mouse, monitor, et cetera. So a really fundamental source of stress and difficulty that people may be facing. And then, as I said, that access to technology. And I just want to emphasize again that the reason I made the heading here, basic space and equipment for safe and productive remote work, is that I think we may first think about productive. Can people be productive? Is it quiet enough? Do they have the right technology to be able to connect to systems that are required for their work, et cetera? But that safety is a key issue even at home, because people may not have those proper setups that they might have in a workplace. And then what we'll explore even more in this webinar is how that basic foundational setup intersects with a variety of other pressures and complications, but also some potentially promising new possibilities that I'll talk about. And all of those things, the main focus of what I'll talk about now, all of those things vary a lot too, by income, by household resources, by health status, by trauma history, citizenship, language, gender, etc. So, with all of that as important context that gets us started, the first common challenge I want to talk about more specifically is new levels of income and resource precariousness. Now, some of you watching this may have employees who are working remotely right now. Your organizations may have employees who are working remotely right now, and that may even include you. But that would make it easy to feel like, oh, good. So the people we're talking about here have jobs because we're talking about your remote employees. But of course, those people may be feeling new levels of uncertainty about hours, about wages, about job security. And also, they very well might have spouses or partners or other wage earners in their households who've been furloughed or laid off or lost their jobs altogether. Or they may have partners or other household members, or even themselves, who've lost income from a business enterprise that they're involved in, maybe a side job for your employee or another household member who runs their own business. So there may be all sorts of resources that are stretched even for remote employees who still have their jobs: food access, housing access, healthcare costs. Their ability to cover all those expenses may be very much affected even while they have their current job with your employer, if that's the lens through which you decided to watch this webinar. So I'm going to leave that issue, that challenge, up in gray on each of the next couple slides where I explore some additional challenges, because it is an underlying context in which all of the other challenges should be considered. But with that one as context there, I want to start with a challenge that I know we're all hearing a lot about, and I bet some of you are experiencing firsthand: home-based education for school-age children and lack of childcare for younger children. Now, this is a huge source of stress and time demand for people. And I think we all know, but many of us are feeling it more strongly than ever, that taking care of kids and educating kids is a full-time job and an exhausting, important full-time job. So for folks who are working remotely, but also have that added into their daily life, there's a huge time demand that they're facing, plus a substantial amount of stress. That's affecting everyone who's working remotely and has kids in the household, but especially women, because they tend to be the primary caregivers. And also, all of that is compounded in important ways by loss of support from folks like school counselors, occupational therapists, special ed personnel, school meal programs, after school programs that provide all kinds of critical services for families, etc. Now, I know all those folks are working hard to try to provide things virtually to families they work with as well, but still, it's not the same level of support that those families who have excuse me, kids that they're schooling at home or have lost childcare are accustomed to. Back when you could send the kids off all day to receive those supportive services in person, that's a very different story. So some of your remote employees that you either work with or that are clients of yours may be dealing with not just the routine stress about home-based education and lack of childcare, but may be dealing with a really heightened amount of stress that comes from losing supportive services that their children may need, that make it even more demanding and stressful to look after those kids. Also, increasingly crowded households are an issue here. These kids are home, right? In the home-based education and lack of childcare. For those who had college-age kids who might have been living on a campus, they're back home probably. Partners may both be working remotely. Other household members may have joined, or other family members, I'm sorry, may have joined the household as everyone adjusts to the precarity of the moment that we find themselves in. And there's been some research on sibling conflicts being heightened in this moment, on there being a lot of tension between parents and kids back from college campuses in all sorts of ways. Tensions that parents experience as they try to hide their stress from younger children who are in the household and are probably picking up on it anyway and confused by it. And family psychologists often suggest that the best approach is to be open with kids in an age-appropriate way, but that if you try to hide the stress from them, they pick up on it and are just confused by it. So that's, a burden for parents to have to juggle and think about. And then conflicts and tensions between spouses and partners in households where there are spouses and partners. Also, I should note, I meant to mention up above in the home-based education and lack of childcare for younger children, not only are women more often primary caregivers in terms of that affecting everyone, but especially women, bullet point I included, but also in single parent households, those are usually headed by women too. So you may have remote working employees or clients of your organization who are single parenting their way through this home-based education and lack of childcare, maybe even with limited resources. And that's an enormously complicated collision of various stresses. I also just want to mention around the increasingly crowded households and the kids in the space too, that I've been involved in some work a few years ago that was focused on child abuse and neglect prevention in our local area, and it stemmed out of some research at the state level that showed that Androscoggin County had a little bit higher than average rates of child abuse and neglect relative to the state as a whole. And as we did some research, focus groups digging into what folks in the area think are the root causes of those slightly higher levels, what it really came down to, in most people's opinion, was a combination of lack of economic resources and lack of social support and connection. And both of those things are, of course, greatly heightened during this particular crisis that we find ourselves in right now. So I left again the new levels of income and resource precariousness, but another set of challenges for families and employees working remotely during the crisis include managing risks from or for household members who are working or spending time outside the home. So maybe our focus first is on the remote working employees, but those remote working employees may have spouses, partners, other family members who are having to go in and out, whether because they're essential workers who need to be in the workplace, or just because they need to go out and take care of elderly relatives, or somebody's got to do that shopping for groceries and prescriptions and necessities. And also, as we begin to open up some aspects of the world around us, as some restrictions are beginning to be eased, then new stresses arise as everyone tries to manage the safety and health risks of having some folks going in and out of the household. And also, many families and households are facing increased caregiving demands for friends and relatives, both inside and outside their own households. So, you know, there may be elderly relatives who were able to take care of themselves before, but now cannot because of, you know, the heightened risk they're at if they go out in the world. I can say that personally, I'm experiencing that. Both of my parents are 89 years old, and we have told them not to leave the house at all. And that means we're bringing a lot of things and doing a lot of things that we hadn't had to do previously. For some folks, this is a matter of friends or relatives who've lost supportive services that they previously had, or folks who have underlying health conditions and can't go out in the world. So there are a lot of increased caregiving demands beyond just what's involved in the homeschool and lack of childcare piece, but other elements as well that produce significant stress for folks, and especially for women, because statistically speaking, they tend to be caregivers for the elderly, for sick relatives and family members, et cetera. And when I say that, I would never mean to be minimizing the significant stress and wonderful work and caregiving that men are doing as well. I'm just saying that statistically speaking, even more so for women. Then another set of common challenges folks are facing, and this is my last slide of challenges. Again, I left the new levels of income and resource precariousness up there at the top as just a reminder that that's always a context in which these other stressors are adding into the story. First, household isolation. So as folks are now finding themselves cut off under stay-at-home orders, there's a loss of social connection and everyday support that are so critical to how all of us normally cope and manage. We get connection and support from each other, we give connection and support to each other, and that's so critical to how we all get by in a community, in a society. So the loss of that social connection and everyday support is really complicated for people. There's a loss of access to individual and group substance use and mental health counseling for many people. And again, we know that lots of organizations are doing a heroic job of trying to move those things online, but people vary in their access to and their interest in online approaches to these kinds of things. So some people are isolated in their households without that access. Also, you know, I mentioned increasingly crowded households on the last slide, but we also know that for some folks, they're isolated all alone, and that creates another kind of stress and difficulty without social support. So loneliness and isolation that many people may be feeling. And then also increased risk of family violence. Some research is indicating that in isolated households, there's an increased risk of family violence as people are trapped inside together and cut off from some of the services, and of course under tremendous additional stress as well. And then I also wanted to talk about grief, loss, fear, and anxiety. And I'm sure everyone knows what I'm talking about here. There's a baseline fear and anxiety for all of us that we're experiencing right now. And then there's also, for example, grief in particular, you know, for those who have lost loved ones during this crisis, whether to COVID-19 or to other causes, we're cut off from the social rituals and connections that usually would comfort us in such difficult times. And people need that so desperately. We've developed those rituals as societies for a reason, because they're what we need from each other. And there's some research that's or not research, but an essay, I'm sorry, that came out recently from a family psychologist who's part of an organization I belong to called the Council on Contemporary Families. And this is a nonpartisan organization that works to bring together research and insight from a variety of researchers, scholars, and family advocates of various sorts, and to provide that information to the press, the media, and to other organizations working with families. And this particular psychologist wrote an essay recently about the way that providing support to people who are dealing with grief, anxiety, and loss is also a distressing need not to have met. So I think the first thing we might think of around grief without social rituals and connections for comfort is the people who are grieving and don't have that comfort. But this particular psychologist is also writing about the ways that not being able to provide not being able to provide comfort to people we care about who are dealing with grief is also distressing. So we've got those levels of additional complication there, right? That not being able to directly comfort loved ones or friends or colleagues who are grieving right now is also painful for people. And then all of that is compounding and compounded by the physical and psychological impacts of adverse childhood experiences, prevalence, and previous exposure to trauma. So I mentioned in one of my earlier slides that I've been involved in helping support some local research that was looking at adverse childhood experiences. And just for anyone who's not familiar with this framework, there's been some very compelling research over the last 25 years or so documenting that there's a set of adverse traumatic experiences folks can have in childhood that have been documented to have lifetime impacts on both physical and mental health for people who've experienced them. And we've done some research locally that's looking at the prevalence of those adverse childhood experiences, how many of our friends and neighbors and coworkers and fellow community members here in Lewiston, Auburn have experienced adverse childhood experiences themselves. And the prevalence is notable, as it is nationally. Not so much that I'm trying to say that it's higher here than elsewhere, but it's higher than you might tend to think if you haven't happened to have had a reason to come across the research that's looked at ACEs. So with significant ACEs prevalence in our community, both from people who are living in great distress and from people who have more secure adult lives, but they have these ACEs in their background and experiences, have trauma exposure, whether recently or long in the past, all of that has important effects on people's physical health that connect to some of the same underlying conditions that make us especially vulnerable to COVID-19, to connections to things like obesity, asthma, diabetes, chronic conditions that can be associated with how risky it is if you do contract COVID-19. But also these adverse childhood experiences and trauma exposure have important impacts on stress responses, on hormones, on our nervous systems in ways that can be really overwhelming, that as people have to deal with all these other challenges that I talked about on the previous slides and higher up on this slide, including the grief and the loss and the fear and the anxiety, then that further compounds previous trauma and is compounded by previous trauma in terms of physical and psychological impacts. So there's a lot that folks are dealing with that's really overwhelming at this difficult moment, and all of which, if you've got folks who are working remotely, many of them in ways that you may not even know, may have these additional complications. So now, without in any way minimizing the importance of those challenges and stresses, which were our main topic for today, I also want to offer a few examples of some of the kinds of things family sociologists and other family scholars and family advocates are writing about, talking about these days as new possibilities that might be suggested or opened up for us socially as we adapt to the remote work and other aspects of this COVID-19 crisis. And the first one is, a lot of people are writing and talking, and maybe you have been too with people you know, about opportunities for renewed family closeness, for slowing down to appreciate and connect. If more of us are staying inside our homes together and finding new ways to connect and appreciate each other. I mean, that's not to minimize the huge stresses that produces that I talked about before, but it is an opportunity, at least for some of us too. Opportunities for independence and curiosity and self-direction among kids who are being asked to take more responsibility for their education than they have in the past. And so maybe a chance to, along with the stress of that schooling at home, to also be thinking about the opportunities it creates to encourage kids to ask themselves, what are you passionate and curious about, and how can you explore new arrangements for sharing household labor and childcare between partners. The research so far suggests that in households that have a male and female partner, that there is some new level of sharing of household labor and childcare, but also that women are still tending to take on the majority of that work. But still, there's a new opportunity here, right? As we are forced into a disruptive and different kind of moment, to think for partners to think, how do we want to be sharing and balancing things together? There are new possibilities for work-home balance through full or partial remote work in some cases, and I italicized in some cases here because a lot of people are writing about concerns that employers may force employees into more remote work after discovering it's possible during this crisis. And because of all those issues around access and so forth that I talked about earlier, who's got the quiet space, who's got the proper equipment, who's got enough social support to be able to left alone working at home, I wouldn't want to encourage people to consider remote work that's enforced as the answer to how we're all moving out from this crisis without some careful thought. But in some cases, if it makes sense for the employer and if it makes sense for the employee, we may all have discovered through this moment some new ways in which we might allow people a few afternoons or a few mornings or a few days a week to be working at home. And that once the kids are back at school and back in childcare and those other caregiving responsibilities are again being shared by a variety of services that have had to go remote, or folks are better able to get around in the world, then, you know, once there are fewer of those other demands, there still may be cool new possibilities that we could all explore, things we've learned from remote work in the crisis that might allow for new ways to balance work and home as we go forward. Another new possibility being suggested is a deeper appreciation and support for public services like schools and teachers, mental health services, nonprofit organizations, and many more. And you know, some of you watching this may be employees of those kinds of organizations, and if so, I hope you're noticing the new level of respect and appreciation some people are having for what you have to offer us all. Greater recognition of the range of contributions we all make, and you know, I bet you've heard some of this talk about new categories of essential workers, that as we begin to think about grocery store workers and healthcare workers, not necessarily just doctors and nurses, but healthcare workers in maybe less highly paid occupations as really essential, that gives us a new opportunity to respect and appreciate each other's contributions to what makes the society work as a whole. And related to that, the last one I'm going to put down here for your consideration is the potential for renewed recognition that we're all interconnected. We all benefit from resilient communities, including vibrant local businesses, local foods, et cetera. You know, some people, as you know, are really working to try to find ways to connect us with local services, and the LA Metro Chamber of Commerce is one of those, and that maybe there's an opportunity for us all there as well. So what I was going to do next in the live version was to have a slide where I put up here a reminder of those challenges, and that's in the upper left there, a reminder of those possibilities. And these are just bulleted lists of short versions of exactly what I talked about: new levels of income and resource precariousness, home-based education for school-age children, lack of childcare for younger children, increasingly crowded households, managing risks for and from household members working outside the home or even just going outside the home, increased caregiving demands for friends and relatives inside and outside households, household isolation, grief, loss, fear, and anxiety as challenges that remote employees and families in general are facing during COVID-19, but also those possibilities we ran through: renewed family closeness, independence, curiosity, and self-direction among kids, sharing household labor and childcare between partners in new ways, new possibilities for full or partial remote work, deeper appreciation and support for public services, greater recognition of the range of contributions we all make, and potential for renewed recognition that we're all interconnected and benefit from resilient communities, including with trauma-informed approaches that allow us to try to build and support resilience in everyone. So before I offer up a few questions that we would have discussed live, but that I hope you'll feel free to be in touch with me about, or that maybe you'll feel inspired to be in touch with other local business and nonprofit community members about, I want to just direct your attention to some resources that I put in the lower left-hand corner of this slide, some local resource links that are really excellent. First, the LA Metro Chamber of Commerce has a fantastic website up connected to the hashtag LA Adapts. And there are all sorts of resources about shopping locally and supporting each other's businesses at this difficult time, and about resources for help that people need and opportunities to get out and about. And it's really great. If you haven't checked it out before, I really recommend it. And they didn't even suggest it to me when they asked me to do this webinar. I just found it on my own and thought it was fantastic. The Maine Department of Health and Human Services has a great COVID resources page if you've got employees or clients or friends or family members or yourself who need some of those government services in particular. And then Growing Our Tree Streets, an organization that I don't know how many of you are already familiar with. I know some of you are, but they're doing great work in the Tree Streets area in downtown Lewiston, connected to the organization Healthy Neighborhoods, connected to Community Concepts, and connected to a housing and urban development grant that is funding a transformation plan for the Tree Streets area. That all of that work, the folks involved in it have put up a local COVID resources page, which also has great resources about government services, nonprofit organization services, ways we can all help and support each other, about housing security, food security, resources about healthcare access, resources about shopping locally and supporting local businesses, etc. So all of those are up there. You don't have the links directly in this screencast, but they're easy to just go look up if you check out the titles for them as well. So the questions I was going to lay out for us to discuss more, for you to ask me about, and for us to hopefully exchange with each other. What challenges are participants experiencing or seeing in your work, in your workplaces, your organizations? What new possibilities do you see arising from that list that I offered, or others that you're noticing? What ideas might you have about insights remote employees might be able to offer to their employers? You know, sometimes it's easy for us to think it's all about the employers or the organizations telling folks out there what they ought to do, but the folks out there, which includes you watching, of course, often are the ones with the real insight and expertise. And if we can try to trust each other during this difficult moment and ask each other, what do you need? How are you doing? I know that one of the things that some people are talking about is whether some employers are requiring so many hours of Zoom meetings and Zoom check-ins, for example, that employees don't feel trusted to get their jobs done in their own way, in their own time, under the very difficult circumstances that we've reviewed here. Obviously, that's a balance that has to be struck differently for any given organization, but it's something to think about. Your remote employees and the folks who are out there struggling as sources of insight and expertise. And then finally, resource sharing. What information and ideas might help us work together, and that might help all of us find our way forward. And I know that the LA Metro Chamber of Commerce is a great place for resource sharing and for providing that central site at which people could consider, letting each other know what they need, what help they need, how we can help each other, etc. So I leave that all as food for thought for anyone who watches. And I want to emphasize again what I said at the beginning, which is I am delighted to be in touch with anyone individually. If you have questions, if you would like more information about research on any of these areas, or if you have thoughts for partnerships you might like to know whether I'd be interested in, or whether I think other Bates faculty might be interested, or I can connect you with the Harvard Center for Community Partnerships. If you haven't partnered with them in the past, we're just happy to be in touch and glad to be part of this community. So again, my email address is ekane@bates.edu, and I would welcome being in touch with any of you. Thanks so much for watching and for the opportunity to talk with you about these important issues. Take care, everybody.